So we're here today, July 13th, 2019, in Antonito, Colorado, at the home of Carole Counihan, who is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at Millersville University. And this is the second in a series of interviews about the development of food anthropology that is sponsored by the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition. I'm David Sutton, and I wanted to start out, Carole, by asking you a little bit about your background in anthropology. You trained at UMass Amherst for your graduate.
Correct.
And so tell us a little bit about what you did your PhD fieldwork on, and how you kind of started to think about food as a topic for anthropological study.
Okay. My dissertation was entitled Food, Culture, and Political Economy, Changing Lifestyles in the Sardinian Town of Boza. So that kind of says it all, I hope. I got into this not because there was a raging interest in food at the time. I did my dissertation prospectus in 1978, and at that time there really was no food anthropology. In fact, I remember the day I said, okay, I've read everything.
Right.
Try that today. It wouldn't work so well. I said, I've read everything. Now I can write my prospectus and go do my field work. And what got me into food was really Italy. I had been a history major as an undergrad. I went to Stanford, graduated in 1970, and went back to Italy with a friend of mine. Tune in, turn on, drop out. So that was the time, and we went back to Italy to have an adventure. And I ended up traveling to Sardinia, fell in love with Sardinia, got fascinated by the people, said I'm going to study anthropology to figure out what makes these people tick. Went back, went to UMass for grad school, and then said, what am I going to study? What am I going to study? And it turns out that, of course, as you well know, Italians talk about food all the time. So I said, food, that's what I'm going to study. At the time, also, I started grad school in 1974. The interest in women's experiences was just starting to really blossom. So I think the Anthropology of Women, Raina Ryder at the time, Raina Rapp's book, came out in 74 or 5. And so did Louise Lamphere and Michelle Zimbalist-Rosaldo's Women, Culture, and Society.
Right.
So it was kind of a convergence of wanting to really study women and put women in the center, wanting to study Italy and food, and they all came together. It happened at the time that George Armelagos was at UMass, and he, in 1980, authored that book with Peter Farb called Consuming Passions. So that was a sort of beginning of an interest in food bubbling up in UMass, and I think he may have taught the first food and culture class or food anthro class in the whole world.
Did you take that class?
No. But I was there as a
Right.
grad student. It was an undergrad class. And he used to alternate teaching it with Sylvia Foreman, who was on my dissertation committee. So that's how I got into it. And I can tell you at the time, I mean, it was practically a joke when I told people that I was studying food. But I did go to the town of Boza in the northwest coast of Sardinia and really wanted to do kind of a holistic study and look at food production, consumption, and distribution, and see how the experiences of Sardinians at the time who were really becoming modern, if we can just encapsulate it that way. They were being drawn ever more into the Italian nation state and into the bigger world. And I wanted to see how that was affecting people on the local level. And I thought food would be a good way to do it.
Right. And your thesis advisor was John Cole, who had done work in Italy, I believe.
In the Alto Adige,
Right.
the sort of German-speaking part of northern Italy that went back and forth from Austria to Italy. Yeah, he and Eric Wolf did co-authored a book together called The Hidden Frontier.
Right. And so how was he supportive of doing a thesis on food?
Yeah. He was pretty hands-off. Pretty laissez-faire. I think my whole graduate program was pretty much that way. So if you wanted to do it, you could do it.
Right.
So I didn't have any obstacles within the department. It was just going out and getting a job that was a little more of a challenge.
Right. And Sylvia Foreman was also on your committee. And you said she had taught this course on food anthropology.
Yep. She taught it alternated with George Armelagos.
And she was doing kind of work in feminist anthropology.
Yep.
So she was supportive of this idea as well, I assume.
Yeah. And the third committee member was Martin Wobst, who was a Europeanist archaeologist.
I see.
So he was just there because he was really smart and I liked the way he thought.
Right. And you also had Donald Pitkin as an advisor?
He was not on my committee. I had Roland Sarti, who was an Italian historian, but I did work with Donald Pitkin. He was at Amherst College, so he was nearby, and I worked with him and hung out and chatted with him, and he was a wonderful person.
Right. And so when you were thinking about this project, was Mary Douglas a person that you were kind of like looking to for inspiration, or were there other people at the time?
I mean, if you think about the kind of the early 80s, and I did my dissertation in 81, but I think, didn't Marvin Harris publish his, I think it was called Food for Thought, and some of his earlier stuff maybe also dealt with food. Mary Douglas, and then of course Sidney Mintz came in. Right. That was 85, I think, Sweetness and Power.
Sweetness and Power, but he had published the article in 79, I think. Yeah,
Time, Sugar, and Sweetness,
right.
That one. Yeah, so those were kind of three pretty big shots in anthropology at the time we were looking at food. So the doors were opening slowly.
And then in terms of your interest in women and gender and thinking about food as this ambiguous kind of thing that's associated with women and in some cases associated with women's oppression and some cases associated with women's power. Were you drawing from particular strands of feminist anthropology in your thinking? Because already there were like debates between the kind of Sherry Ortner a structuralist approach and Rosaldo's kind of more drawing from sociology approach, and then the Marxist feminists, people like Leacock and Peggy Sanday, and then of course there was also I don't know if this was part of your thinking, but there was that famous article by Susan Carole Rogers about the myth of male dominance in rural France.
The men are dummies.
Yeah.
Paper. Yeah, and I think Karen Brodkin Sachs's article in the Women, Culture, and Society, where she looked at Engel's work and kind of rethought the origin of the family. I think that was very instrumental in thinking about the, production, reproduction, inside the home, outside the home, power, no power. That was very instrumental. And I also think in terms of the gender stuff, there was a lot of work coming out on women and body image and eating disorders. And that was a really strong feminist strain to a lot of that work. They were not anthropologists, but they were psychologists, sociologists, and so on. And I think that was pretty influential in terms of starting to think about how women over time have been objectified in their bodies and how that played out in women's relationship to food. So that was also really important as I kind of got more and more into this.
Yeah, I remember the article you wrote on food and bodily boundaries, which is a great example of kind of using comparative work to challenge our assumptions, and you really kind of showed how the very different relationship to bodily boundaries, and I think you were using some Amazonian societies contrasted with U.S. society, where bodies were much more bounded for men and not necessarily for women, and so that created an inequality.
Yeah, and that came out of Nancy Chodorov and Carole Gilligan's work at the time.
I see.
Which is, boy, that's way back there.
Yeah.
But yeah, the bounded versus permeable boundaries that women have had in Western culture. Yeah.
So you were drawing, I guess, on all the different strands of things going on at the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So that work that you did in Sardinia on kind of looking at the effects of modernization and capitalism and individualism on these traditional communities in terms of food. I'm struck by some of the images you presented there. For example, you had this contrast between the two Easter breads, and one was kind of handmade by this woman in the shape of a bird, that you said symbolized kind of fertility, and then you had the kind of bread made by the baker, which was just kind of standard shape, and it had BP written on it to mean Buena Pascha, and how you kind of use that to talk about the differences between this kind of this food that was part of a tradition but was also part of individual expression versus this very standardized and kind of also lexified.
Yeah, exactly.
So was that kind of symbolic of some of the changes more generally that you saw there?
Yeah, I mean, even in terms of food procurement, instead of growing their own food, they were increasingly shopping at stores, and not just the little neighborhood stores, but these little mini supermarkets were starting to pop up, which relied on self-service. You'd go and pick the stuff, whereas the old stores, you'd go in and chat with a señora, whatever her name was, and I need a little, 100 grams of this and 50 grams of that and a half kilo of this. And so it was a thinning, I think, of social relations around food that kind of cut across many dimensions: consumption, production, and distribution.
Right. And And then you decided to move your research to Tuscany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how did that come about?
I have to put a parenthesis here. A lot of my trajectory followed a kind of personal pathway, as I think so many anthropologists' work does. So my long-term relationship with the Florentine, Lorenzo, was coming to an end after 13 years. And I just thought, I've spent 13 years here. I want to do something with this rich experience that I've had. And so I decided to do this project on all of the living members of his extended family. So, and also what got me into doing that project was when I did my work in Boza, I did not have a tape recorder. And I really missed that when it came time to write, because I really wanted to have people's voices. And all I had were, you know, very, very extensive field notes, but it was in my words. So and part of the reason was I had been too shy to pull out a tape recorder on people. And when I got to Florence, these were people that I had known for many years. We were already very close. And so whipping out the tape recorder was no problem. And it was, I think because I had known them already and they trusted me and I trusted them, it was really easy to jump in and get some very rich data. So, and also, I really liked the idea of this family cluster as a sort of logical unit within urban environment. You know, 350, 400,000 Florentines. How do you carve out a unit that makes sense? Now, of course, one family is not the whole society, but every family has its breadth, you know, upper class, working class, male, female, generational. And so that family turned out to be a pretty good focus for me. In fact, I just wrote a paper on food and memory. It's called Food, Memory, and Shame in Florence, Italy, for Greg de St. Maurice and Beth Forrest's book on food, memory, and imagination, that I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, I can milk this one more time. So there were really a lot of reasons, but that was a sort of personal trajectory that got me into doing that research.
So that's where you developed the concept of food-centered life history, I think.
Yes, that's right. The idea was, let's get a picture of a person's life, and these several, I think there were 23 Florentines that I interviewed for that study. A holistic picture of their life, but through this narrow lens of food. Or it's not actually that narrow, it's like, so everything to do with food in their lives. And now, as I was thinking about this paper on food and memory, one of the things I discovered was that people talk about general memories and specific memories. So general memories is, oh, we used to eat a chicken once a week. And a specific memory would be, oh, there was this time I ate this chicken and I got so sick and blah, 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 blah. And I think if I were doing it now, I would try to probe a little bit more for those specific memories, because they seem to be few and far between and really interesting and revealing.
Right.
But, you know, I asked about food and child rearing, food for infants, breastfeeding, food and pregnancy, food production, gardening, rituals, memories, dreams, whatever. And it was very rich in Florence, and I did the same methodology here in Antonito, where I did field work from 96 to 2006 and did it with women.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to come to that soon, but I wanted to ask you a bit more about the Florentine research, and also about that was there the idea of food voice at that point out there as a concept?
Yeah, I mean, what had it, I'm not sure when, for example, I started talking about food, and I always said food as voice. And I think Annie Hawk-Lawson sort of coined the term food voice. But definitely it was clear, both in Italy and in the US, that for many women, food was a voice. Either, you know, not putting enough salt in the pasta because you were mad at your husband. You don't have to say a word, just, oh, this pasta's not salted enough. Whoa! Or burning the food, or eating to stuff down unpleasant feelings or unpleasant emotions. And so I think particularly for women who, of course, are associated with food in most, if not all, cultures from a very early age, it was a particularly strong voice, which is not to say it's not a voice for men too, but particularly for women.
I wonder that in cultures where taste is so important, that kind of manipulation of food as an expression becomes more powerful because people can tell the difference. With you can be very subtle and still be saying something, whereas in the U.S., typical U.S. family, you'd have to kind of say it louder.
Really leave out the salt.
Exactly.
Just put a little less in. I think that's an interesting question. Because, you know, when I did my study here, sorry to keep coming back to this, but taste and food diversity were much, much less here. And so, and yet women still used food to speak, to connect with people, to express anger with their husbands and all the rest. So I'm not sure. I think it would be an interesting hypothesis to work through. But certainly I think cultures give different emphasis to taste.
Right.
Big time.
In the Florentine book, I remember how you really do capture like a whole way of life through documenting the different aspects of food practices, and you really seem to be getting at some of the paradoxes of so-called modernity, both in terms of family and the kind of decline of this notion of an extended family, and there was one guy who you talked to, I remember, who is more concerned about his son eating with his girlfriend than sleeping with his girlfriend.
Yeah, right.
And then also the kind of some of the implications of these changes on gender relations, also very kind of ambivalent, and you recognize kind of opportunities but also kind of losses in that process.
Yeah. Yeah, the woman who worked, she was a full-time worker in a raincoat factory, and she said, you know, we women are all sacrificed. We're all overburdened because we have to work at home and do all the food work and all the other work at home, and then we work outside the home. But I don't want to give up the work outside the home because it gives me money and it gives me independence. But then how do I get all the work at home done? And that tension, which could be relieved by sharing all the work at the home and then sharing the work outside the home. But that didn't really play. And she actually was the woman whose husband did do the cooking. But as he said, well, I do the cooking, but here, I'll tell you, I leave a mountain of dishes every day. And so she had to do the dishes. But she was okay, because at least he did the cooking.
Right.
So I think it's a tension that I think we're still feeling in the modern world of how to get the work at home done and the work outside the home done in an equitable manner.
Right, right. And also coming back to that issue of taste for a moment, I remember you have some informants who talk about the loss of taste as part of modernity, or both the loss of the quality of the food, but also this sense of almost a kind of nostalgia for the desire. This line, these days every day is Sunday.
Yeah, yeah. Good for you. Boy, you read that book closely. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, the desire, the relationship between the desire for something and the ease with which you get it. And the real concept that I think emerged in the interviews was, if you desire it, you're going to appreciate it more. If you desire the food, when you finally get it, it tastes so much better. Like the old guy who remembered making ice cream. He said every Sunday they made ice cream in the square of Trespiano above Florence. And this was probably the 20s. And he goes, we had to keep rotating the old handmade crank. Zoom, zoom, zoom. So you got that real sense of a physical memory embedded in the body. But how, we kept waiting. Hopefully the paying customers won't eat it all, because if they didn't, then he'd give it to us kids who helped them make it. And so that desire that is fostered by scarcity, and the taste that is fostered by the desire, which he linked to sex. It's the same thing with sex. Now everybody's doing it and they don't appreciate it. But in my day, just to dance with a woman.
Wow.
So it was interesting, that overlap between food and sex, which we see in lots of theaters.
In lots of,
lots of arenas.
That's
is
right.
What I'm trying to say.
That's right.
Yeah.
Certainly in metaphor.
Yeah.
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 I mean, I even, talking about your first idea, I remember as a kid growing up in New York City, how people always had like secret places where you could get some special thing, and like to learn that was part of like having the important knowledge, so that it also set up this kind of idea that it wasn't easy to find this thing. You had to know the right store or the right whatever it was, and it made it so much more. The anticipation was definitely part of the pleasure. Yeah. And so coming to your research in Antonito, and you did, as you said, a similar study, but you were focused on the women rather than this extended family, and you found, as you kind of suggested, some similarities there, but also presumably that comparative perspective revealed some differences as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things is in the sort of ground, literally in Tuscany, you have fresh food all year round because of the climate, the water, the temperate zone. I mean, things are growing all year round. And so people would talk about this anticipation. Oh, the asparagus are coming in. Oh, the string beans are in. The tomatoes. And even in the winter, there's fresh food all year round. And here, I mean, you ask people what they ate, and they said beans, potatoes, and meat. And chili, red chili. But beans, potatoes, and meat. Oh, and flour tortillas. And that would go all year round. And in the summer, yes, you get fresh stuff, but it's such a short time. I mean, I planted my garden, I planted lettuce early June, and I'm just starting to harvest it now, and it'll go, through maybe the end of September. It'll last if there's no early frost. And that's it on the fresh food. And so what they used to have to do was dry a lot of food, everything. They dried the meat and made, jerky. They dried vegetables. They dried chilies. I mean, anything, fruit. And it's just not the same. Wow. Eating dried food. They would freeze it once freezers came in. But the diet didn't have that rich, kind of constant seasonal variety that you got in Tuscany, or that we've gotten, by importing foods. And so I think that there was a much less exciting relationship to food and to taste than there was in Tuscany. And so it becomes interesting in other ways. It's a bond in the family, just like it was in Tuscany. And people cared about having meals together, just like in Tuscany. But that exaltation of taste that you see in Italy just didn't emerge.
Right. And also in ritual here in Antonito, it was an important part, I believe.
Yeah, I don't have a lot on food rituals here. I'm thinking death rituals. That's right. Yes. But again, it was more the act of bringing food and giving food and sharing food than a focus on the specific qualities of the food themselves. Which is not to say that, people didn't recognize really good cooks, but it's different from what I've seen in Italy. And Italy is, of course, on one end of the spectrum, right? Of fixation with taste and good food and all that.
But in the book, A Tortilla's Like Life, you also introduce, I think, this phrase, food as a recipe for agency.
I do? Okay.
I think so. I mean,
somewhere along the way.
I mean, I know it's in there. I don't know that it's in the earlier work, that particular, but that as a way of thinking about, because as you said, you were particularly interested in women's experiences here.
Yeah, here I focused on the women. In Tuscany, I started with the women, and then it just kind of naturally expanded to include the men, and they were, I think, really important here because my husband Jim is also an anthropologist and was also doing field work at the same time with men. I felt like, okay, he can cover that base and I'll cover the women's base. And I think it can be a recipe for agency in some interesting ways. The woman I interviewed the most here was my former neighbor, Helen Rubal, who lives right across the street over there. And I interviewed her 17 times, and she said to me, she was the one who said, "I'm not really a kitchen guy, if you know what I mean." She was a teacher, and her whole life she was a teacher, and she was a professional woman, and that was her identity. So the refutation of the cooking responsibilities was in some sense a path for her to follow to agency.
Right.
Although at the same time she respected her sister, who was a stay-at-home mom and a wonderful cook. So it's it was that differential consciousness idea that I explored in an article about her that I included in the Food and Culture Reader.
Now, in your most recent work in Sardinia, you actually returned to Sardinia to explore the shape of the contemporary food movement there. I have a number of questions about that, but for starters, how would you characterize broadly the food movement? Is it would you say it's more united in what it's opposing than in what it actually stands for in some ways, assuming that it's developed in opposition to kind of industrial agriculture and all of that, or is that not correct?
I think they're both sides of it. So, I mean, clearly slow food is in opposition to fast food, but it's so much more than that. And the food movement, sort of in all of its ramifications, I think is opposed to a certain kind of food, which is industrial food. But it seems to be also about community, for example, reforging community, particularly in Sardinia, where so many people who live in the city where I work, the city of Cagliari, they came from the hinterland, from the rural areas. So they've, in some sense, maybe romanticized village life, but they also miss that sense of belonging somewhere that they lost when they came to the city. And so, for example, the urban garden, they call themselves agriculture, we cultivate relationships, to really emphasize building relationships between people, but also between people and plants and the earth and nature.
And you also characterize this research as about middle-class activism. So I was curious about that. Is that indicative of that this is something that one needs to be middle class to be able to afford to engage in this, or is that just a happenstance of field work? Obviously, we all kind of know Bourdieu's metaphor of taste as distinction and all of that, so I wondered how that played into things.
When I wrote my book, the chapter I did on slow food, I called something about slow food and middle class activism. Because I think a lot of slow food is located in places where the consumer is paramount. Even though it's very important to recognize that slow food always wants to build in the producers, who may or may not be middle class. But I think for the other kinds of phenomena that I studied, they're maybe not quite so heavily middle class. Like the urban garden, for example, one of the three people I interviewed was unemployed. He had lost his job. He'd been a petrochemical industry worker, coming from a village, going into the boom of the late 60s and early 70s when Sardinia was developing. Joined the petrochemical industry, which then collapsed in Sardinia, and so he was out of a job. He turned to the urban garden to both foster his ideals of doing something with the land, but also to grow some food so he could feed his family. I think the GAS, the Gruppo d'Acquisto Solidale, or Solidarity Purchase Groups, draw from a range of classes. And in fact, part of their goal is not just to get quality food, but at good prices. And those good prices are for both the consumers and the producers. Hopefully, by eliminating the middleman, they're going to pay the farmers a lot more, but they're going to pay themselves out of pocket a lot less. So I don't think it's necessarily restricted to a middle class at all. I mean, some of the other programs are farm-to-school programs, which reach across the spectrum and include all kids. So,
and you also kind of talk about how, in terms of gender, this is a space of relatively egalitarian gender opportunities, that those issues that you documented elsewhere are maybe a little less prominent in this activist space. Is that right?
That is what I found. I found quite a number of women in leadership positions. For example, the head of Slow Food Cagliari, well, I was there, was a woman. The current head is now a man, so it fluctuates. The organizing committee was 5 women and 4 men. On the other hand, the Urban Garden, most of the organizing committee were men. The Solidarity Purchase Group was led by men. So I think, old structures die hard. But because it's food, women have, I think, a natural opening to step up and feel confident of their expertise, so that there's a space for them. And that's something. That's not to say there's no sexism, but I didn't see a lot of sexism.
And that wasn't expressed to you as a big problem by your informants.
Right, it was not. And I would raise the issue and they'd kind of brush it aside.
Right.
What I did not do, which I kind of wish I had, was try to get at the home life of the same people that were active politically in the public sphere. Some of these women, I sort of wish I had, what's going on at home? Who cooks? Who shops? But I didn't really think of it at the time. I didn't think of trying to put those two things together, because that's obviously, women are more and more entering the public sphere. Are men entering the private sphere is really the question.
Right.
And in the 80s in Tuscany, they were not. I think they're more so doing it in Italy, but I don't think it's a big revolution.
I see. And one of the nice things I think about the book is that you're very honest about some of the things that you studied which were successful and some which ended up being not successful, or a number of people who seem very committed, but then you note actually they left the movement at a certain point. And so I guess my question here would be, well, you wrote a whole book about it, so obviously you're at some level you're optimistic, I think, about the potential of these movements. Do you feel like there are certain strategies that are more successful than others, or?
Boy, that is a good question. I think the big deal breaker is really whether there's public political support. So, for example, I wrote about the urban garden in my Sardinia book, and the cover of the book is the Cagliari urban garden, but that garden died. And the reason it died was they were unable to get public land. They got private land on which to put the garden, but there was no water. This is the Mediterranean. Doesn't rain at all summer. So every drop of water they had to carry to this garden, which was up a steep hill, and it just wasn't feasible. So if you had a garden that had municipal water, even free water, you'd be miles ahead.
I see.
And but on the plus side, even though the garden died, the enthusiasm among the residents for the garden was through the roof. And they said they had way more requests to participate than they could manage. And people love coming there, and they love learning about permaculture and so forth and so on. So I think there's a demand for these things, and I think eventually, hopefully, the political system will catch up. But in Cagliari, they did not have a lot of support. Now in Parma, they've had urban gardens from way back. And I think there was something like 2,000 urban garden plots in Parma that were supported by the municipality. So when you get that kind of support, the sky's the limit.
I see. Well, because when they talk, I mean, people would complain about the bureaucracy. They would also say, we Sardinians can't cooperate or something like that. But so is that what you're talking about in terms of public support or non-support?
I think it's the political powers that be that is what I'm talking about. And what Sardinians would say is, oh, well, in northern Italy, they have habits of associationism. We're behind on that. On the other hand, other people say, don't say that. It's not true. It's not who we are as Sardinians. But I think it was the political structures were absent in Cagliari, whereas, again, Tuscany, Lombardy, Piedmont, you have more progressive political organizations, governments often, so you get more things done. There's a guy named Giovanni Orlando who worked in Palermo, Sicily, on an effort to get I think it was a farmer's market. And they set one up, and then the town said, no, you can't have this land anymore. And so, again, struck down. And then they had to go. I think they eventually found a spot on the university campus. But, you know, the two things, I mean, when the people organize and get moving, sometimes the politicians respond and provide resources or spaces or water or whatever. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, certainly some of those school programs seemed like they were scaling up, but they were making a real difference in terms of where people were getting their food from local sources instead of,
Yeah, and the school program was a really good example of a program that managed to bring together diverse political entities. So the health service, the schools, the provincial government, the town government, and in an area of Sardinia that was very depressed economically. And I think they said, let's try it. We need to do something to jumpstart the economy. So maybe desperation helps too.
Right. Another thing that kind of stands out in the book, well, you talk about the importance of taste, coming back to that theme of taste, and some of the quotes once again from your informants, like taste is the protagonist in this story. I think one of the people said, and we grab them with the senses, I think somebody else said. And so the kind of the way that resonates for people, I think you kind of talk about the importance of taste, and then the importance of this concept that you use, the word territorio, which is maybe similar to terroir, or Italian version of terroir. I just wondered kind of how you thought about that, because also one of your recent works is this edited collection, Making Taste Public, and kind of bringing taste into the political domain.
Yeah, political and social and shared, as opposed to thinking about it as in one person's mouth and brain and nose.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
As our colleagues in the neurogastronomy field tend to do,
Yeah. Again, as you said, one person said we grab them with the senses, and it's a way to reach certain people that may not be politically awake or even interested or motivated. But when you say, here, try this cheese from this shepherd, from this community, now here, try this from the supermarket. Oh, I get it. I get the difference. Let's think about then what happens if I buy the food from this shepherd in this community. Oh, I'm supporting local people, I'm supporting local agriculture, yada, yada, yada. So it becomes an entry into just a broader way of thinking about things. And I think it's slow because there's still people who say, I don't care, I just want to eat the good cheese. Get it to me. But even the ones that are at that spot, at some point can start opening up to a discourse about why this cheese is better and this one is worse, and why this one's more expensive and this one's cheaper, and start a process of thinking, critical thinking about food, which is, I think, a big part of the food movement. Right. So it sort of gets back to your question of, is it oppositional or is it something else? It's really about informing consumers to be more critical consumers.
And in terms of the territorio, is that terroir as we think about it? Are there nuanced differences?
The way they used it in Sardinia in these interviews, it was a very big, encompassing concept that referred to place in the simplest way, or meaningful place is the way I translated it. But it's the physical place as well as the whole culture and history that goes with that place. And so when it comes to food, it's like terroir. But I think when it's just tossed around in my interviews, it's bigger. I don't know if the French would talk about, my home terroir.
I see.
And I think also what's interesting is it's a relatively new word, a new concept. When I was in Cagliari, there was a study group that Professor Benedetto Melloni had on food and territory, cibo e territorio. And so they invited me to kind of be part of their group. And we talked about the origin of the word territorio in the sense that people were using it. Oh, it's the place, but it's everything. And they suggested that it was a relatively new concept that had kind of come in through academics, through sociologists, into parlance, current parlance. Because in the old days, people wouldn't say it's the territorio, they would say it's the Marmilla, or it's the Campidano, or it's the Nuorese. These are specific places.
I see.
So it'd be like it's Carbondaleism, and they wouldn't say it's the territory. So I don't know if that's true. It's one of those things that's really hard to document, but they used it a lot in the interviews, whether I raised the topic or not.
Right, and you raised a few questions about kind of what I got the sense that it was something that didn't have necessarily a political valence, and that maybe people of different political viewpoints would kind of share this notion of territorio, but at the same time you raised questions about what it meant for kind of migrant communities and in Sardinia.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Do the left and the right use it in the same way and to the same extent? I haven't really thought about that. But what I did think about was the foods of the territorio, which were so exalted, would be exclusionary to immigrants. And there aren't many immigrants at this point in Sardinia. This is 4 to 7%, I think, of the population. So it's a fairly small number, but they're coming, and they're foods and their territorio is not Italian. So what happens then? And I know I have one colleague whom I met at UNIS, can't remember her name right now, but she's studying Muslim children in, I think, Milan, in school children in Milan, where it was a real issue because they can't eat pork, for example. And that's our food, we Italians. So I think these are issues that are coming, but they're kind of under the surface so far.
Right. So you've put together what I think is the only reader in food anthropology, and has gone through to date, I think, 4 editions. Is that right? Clearly, you've given a lot of thought to the teaching of the anthropology of food. And though I imagine the reader is not just used in anthropology classes. Could you talk a bit about the challenges and benefits of putting that together and about teaching food anthropology more broadly?
Sure. The reader actually came out of teaching. So I was teaching food and culture, as was Penny Van Esterik, my co-editor. And I guess both of us were thinking about a reader, and Marley Wasserman came up to me at a meeting. She was the editor at Routledge and said, "Hey, have you thought about doing a reader?" I was like, there's a good idea. So again, in 1997, when the first edition came out, the challenges were much less because there was less stuff to choose from.
Right.
And then each successive iteration, I think the second one was, let's see, 2008 maybe, and then 2013, and then the latest I think it was 2018 that it was its imprint. So each time it's like, oh my gosh, there's more and more good stuff. And it is actually used across fields. It's not all anthropology, and it's used in literature and archaeology and philosophy, and we've had all kinds of people telling us they used it. Right. I think that a pro and a con of teaching food anthropology is that everybody's an expert. So the students all come into the class with some expert knowledge, their own,
Right.
which they don't have if you're teaching medieval history, right? They have no knowledge whatsoever. And so I think that was really always a plus. But then if they think they know it all, that's a negative. Yeah. So you have to kind of build from what they do know into the critical thinking that anthropologists want to develop. I think also what I really appreciated about teaching it was what the students could bring back. You know, again, because they know something, they have some genuine knowledge and specific experience that can inform whatever it is we're talking about in class. So that's a plus. And I think a third thing was that in some sense, they push me towards the study of food activism or food and social movements.
I see.
Because I noticed little by little, they became more interested in, you know, the food system or good food versus bad food or whatever. And so it was their interest in the politics of food that helped push me in that direction as well.
All right. Well, picking up on what you said about kind of the growth of choices for the reader, you've also been editing the kind of flagship journal of food studies, Food and Foodways, for over 15 years now?
At least 1,000 years.
Yeah.
I actually started in 1981 working with that journal before it got started.
Wow.
And Steve Kaplan called me in my first job, which was at Franklin and Marshall College, and said, "Hey, we're starting this journal. Do you want to get on board?" So I started as a lowly assistant editor, and the first issue came out, I think, in '85. And so I've been with it since '85. So how many years is that? 15 and 19.
30, yeah.
34.
Yeah.
And slowly moved up to associate editor and then senior editor and then finally editor-in-chief. It's been really interesting, really, really interesting. I like editing. I'm kind of a compulsive editor, so anytime I read anything, I'm always red penning it. And it's interesting to see what people are thinking about.
And do you feel like you've seen shifts in food studies in terms of where we're going, like this, what you said about your students pushing you more toward the politics? Is that also reflected in what you're seeing in the journal?
Somewhat, but I think, it's an interdisciplinary journal, but people are coming from their disciplinary perspectives. So a medieval historian is going to be talking not about food activism, but about food in medieval cookbooks, let's say. I think we had a submission recently on was it food and health across several centuries of history. So we had one on a historian. This one's coming out, I think, soon, on the Vegan Society, which was a society in England that published one of the first vegan journals. And that's a contemporary issue, but this person looked at it from a historical perspective. So we get all kinds of stuff.
Right.
All kinds of stuff. I just got a submission about manna. It's called geshinga, some Turkish word, but it's really the manna from the Bible that you hear about, manna from heaven, which is some substance that forms on the bark of trees or the leaves of trees. I can't remember. Right. So it's all kinds of stuff.
Right.
If you're asking me what I think, where the field is heading, it may be heading in directions that partly Food and Foodways is heading, but it's partly going on its own ways. It seems to me there's a lot of interest in sustainability right now. Sustainability, whether it's through growing or consuming or distributing. I think there's perhaps maybe going to be some more interest in food politics, food for peace or food for war, and how to use food to create a better planet, which I think is a really important issue. There are people looking at food diplomacy. Right. And I was thinking about this today, about when Trump brought whatever sports team it was to the White House and served McDonald's.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's one way to do this, but there are other ways. And, Michelle Obama had her garden. Right. So I think people are interested in how food is going to play a role in politics.
One of the things that I've looked at recently is how talk about the border and the border wall, and some of the resistance to that has been expressed in kind of notions of turning the border into a giant table where people could share things across the table. Yeah.
And of course they've been doing that. The foods, Mexico and Tex-Mex have been going across the border since time immemorial. Right. That's a cool idea.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Carole. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and getting this overview of your really prodigious career and your influence on the field. And I'm really so glad I had the chance to do this.
Thank you, and thank you for your close reading of my work. Rare and beautiful things.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.